The grand hall was buzzing with laughter, clinking glasses, and the sound of soft music playing in the background. It was a night meant for celebration, where the wealthy gathered to show off their riches, their charm, and their power. Among the sea of tuxedos and designer dresses stood a quiet figure in a plain uniform, Grace, the housemaid. She moved silently from table to table, unnoticed by most, just another shadow in a world that didn't see her. But tonight, that was all about to change. The host of the evening, Mr. Whitmore, a man known for his wealth and pride, had a habit of turning people into entertainment. Spotting Grace near the piano, he called her over with a smirk and a booming voice. "Come on now, Grace," he said, eyes gleaming with mischief. "Play us something, won't you?" The room chuckled, some awkwardly, others with cruel amusement. They didn't expect much. After all, she was just the help. Grace hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. The piano was polished and grand, a centerpiece in the room, but one she was never allowed to touch. Her heart raced as all eyes turned toward her. This wasn't a kind invitation. It was a challenge meant to humiliate her, to remind her of her place. But as she sat down and placed her fingers on the keys, something shifted. No one in that room could have guessed what was about to happen. They didn't know the life she lived before this job, or the music that once filled her world. And as the first note rang out, clear and beautiful, the room began to change. The laughter faded, replaced by silence and awe. What happened next left every guest speechless. Grace's fingers moved with a quiet confidence, each note flowing into the next like a river that had been waiting too long behind a dam. The room, once loud with shallow chatter, now sat in frozen silence. Even Mr. Whitmore's smug expression slowly faded into confusion, then something else, something he couldn't quite name. But Grace wasn't playing for them. Her eyes were focused on the keys, but her mind was somewhere far away, back in the little church where she first learned to play. Her mother, now gone, used to sit beside her, gently guiding her hands over the worn keys. Music was more than sound to Grace. It was memory, comfort, strength. She hadn't touched a piano in years. Life had become about long hours, low pay, and keeping her head down. After losing her parents and dropping out of music school, she'd taken the first job she could find to survive. Working in Mr. Whitmore's mansion meant swallowing pride every single day, dealing with rude remarks, and being invisible in plain sight. But never, not once, did she forget who she truly was. Now here she was, dragged into the spotlight not by choice, but by mockery. Mr. Whitmore had expected to get a laugh out of the crowd, to make a point about power and place. But the moment Grace began to play, he unknowingly gave her a stage, a moment that couldn't be taken back. Whispers began to rise among the guests. Who is she? How does she play like that? Why is she just a maid? Questions swirled in their minds, but none dared speak too loudly. All eyes remained fixed on her, and for the first time in a long time, Grace felt truly seen. But not everyone in the room was happy about it. As Grace played on, a storm began to brew behind the calm expressions in the room. Mr. Whitmore stood frozen, his jaw tight, arms crossed over his chest. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected her. The music wasn't just beautiful, it was commanding. It shifted the mood in the room, pulling the attention away from him and placing it squarely on someone he considered beneath him. And that didn't sit well. Among the crowd, whispers kept growing. Some were in awe, others uncomfortable. A few guests exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to applaud or stay silent. Not because they didn't enjoy the music, but because it challenged the quiet order they all followed. Grace wasn't supposed to shine. She was supposed to serve. In the corner stood Elena, Mr. Whitmore's daughter, watching intently. She remembered Grace from years ago, not just as the maid, but as the girl who helped her with her violin when she was still learning. Grace had been patient, kind, and gifted even then. But Elena had grown up under strict rules, told not to mingle too closely with the staff. Now, for the first time, she questioned those rules. What else had she missed by blindly following them? Meanwhile, Thomas, another staff member and close friend of Grace, watched with pride and fear. He knew what this moment meant. Grace had cracked something open that couldn't be closed again, and he also knew Mr. Whitmore's temper. The more Grace shined, the more threatened he'd feel. As the final notes echoed through the hall, no one dared to speak first. The silence felt heavy, stretched thin by tension. Grace stood up slowly, meeting Mr. Whitmore's cold stare for just a second before lowering her eyes. She didn't know what would happen next, but something had changed, and not everyone would accept it. The silence after Grace finished playing was louder than any applause could have been. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, others kept their eyes locked on her, unsure of what to do. Mr. Whitmore finally cleared his throat, forcing a stiff smile, trying to regain control of the room. "Well, who knew?" he said, voice dripping with false charm. "Our maid has a hidden talent." But the damage was done. His attempt to embarrass her had backfired in the most public way possible. And beneath the surface of his forced grin, something darker stirred, a quiet fury. Grace stepped back, eyes scanning the crowd. She saw faces she'd passed 100 times in the hallways, now looking at her like they were seeing her for the first time. But not all the attention felt safe. A few guests looked toward Mr. Whitmore, waiting for a cue on how to react, their loyalty stronger than their sense of awe. The power in the room was shifting, and it wasn't clear who would try to take it back, or how. In the kitchen, whispers among the staff started spreading. Word traveled fast. Some were proud. Others were nervous. They knew Mr. Whitmore didn't like being upstaged, especially not by someone he viewed as beneath him. And now, in front of his closest friends and business partners, he'd been shown up in his own home. Elena quietly left the group of guests and slipped into the hallway, her mind racing. She needed to speak to Grace. Something about this felt bigger than one performance. It felt like the beginning of something none of them were prepared for. She wasn't sure who she was more afraid for, Grace or her father. Back in the hall, Mr. Whitmore's voice cut through the tension. "Let's move on, shall we?" But the night wasn't over. And neither was the storm. Just as the guests began to murmur and drift toward the dining room, pretending the night hadn't just turned on its head, the front door opened. A tall man in a grey suit stepped inside, pausing as he noticed the lingering tension in the air. He wasn't on the guest list. In fact, no one seemed to recognize him, except Grace. Her breath caught the moment their eyes met. It was her former music teacher, Mr. Daniels, a well-respected pianist and composer who had once mentored her during her time at the conservatory. He looked older now, grayer, but his sharp gaze hadn't dulled. He scanned the room, then stepped forward with calm confidence, holding a small envelope in one hand. "Apologies for the intrusion," he said, his voice steady but commanding. "I was invited by Elena Whitmore. I believe she wanted me to hear something remarkable." All eyes turned to Elena, who stepped forward hesitantly, clutching her phone. "I recorded Grace's performance," she said quietly. "I sent it to him right after she played." Mr. Whitmore's face darkened. "This is a private event," he said coldly, eyes narrowing at both Elena and Mr. Daniels. "You had no right." But Mr. Daniels cut him off. "With all due respect, I had to hear it for myself. That wasn't just talent, it was something rare, and it shouldn't be hidden behind a uniform and a serving tray." Gasps echoed through the room. Grace stood frozen, unsure if this was a dream or another setup. Mr. Whitmore clenched his jaw, his control slipping by the second. What began as an attempt to belittle her had now spiraled into something he couldn't stop. Then came the real shock. Mr. Daniels opened the envelope and pulled out a folded letter. "The Royal Conservatory has an open slot, and I believe this belongs to Grace." The room held its breath. Grace stared at the letter in Mr. Daniels' hand, her mind struggling to catch up. The Royal Conservatory, the very place she'd once dreamed of studying, before life took everything she loved and pushed her into the background. Her hands trembled slightly as she stepped forward, eyes searching his face for any sign that this was real. "It's not charity," Mr. Daniels said gently, as if reading her thoughts. "Your performance tonight was more than enough. This is your second chance, Grace." But before she could respond, Mr. Whitmore stepped in between them. His voice was low, sharp with anger. "She works for me. She signed a contract. She doesn't just walk out because someone thinks she can play a few notes." The crowd stiffened. Whispers rose again, louder now, judgment in every corner of the room. Elena moved beside Grace, her voice firm. "Dad, stop. This isn't about contracts. It's about dignity. About talent. You tried to humiliate her, and she proved she's more than this house ever allowed her to be." Mr. Whitmore's face flushed red, but the room was no longer on his side. His authority, once unshakable, was unraveling right in front of him. Grace took a deep breath and stepped around him, reaching for the letter. But just as her fingers touched it, Mr. Daniels added something no one expected. "There's more," he said, glancing at the room. "She won't be going alone. One of the conservatory sponsors was here tonight, incognito." He heard everything. From the back of the room, a well-dressed older gentleman stepped forward. "I'm funding her full scholarship," he said simply, "and offering her a place on our winter tour." Gasps swept through the hall. Grace looked down at the letter, then up at the people who once looked through her. The door that had always been closed was now wide open. But just as she turned to leave, Thomas rushed in from a hallway, pale and out of breath. "Grace," he said, voice shaking, "there's something you need to know about Mr. Whitmore, about why he never wanted you near that piano." The room went silent once more. Grace froze. Her eyes met Thomas's, and in them, she saw something deeper than fear. Truth. Mr. Whitmore shifted uneasily as Thomas stepped forward. "Years ago," Thomas began, voice steady despite the weight of what he carried, "Mr. Whitmore had a sister. She was a gifted pianist, just like Grace. But when she chose music over the family business, he cut her off completely. Said talent wouldn't pay the bills, said it was a waste of time. She left. No one ever heard from her again." A heavy silence followed. Mr. Whitmore didn't deny it. He simply turned away, jaw clenched, exposed not just as cruel, but haunted. The reason he never allowed music in the house, the reason he tried to silence Grace, was rooted in guilt, and maybe even shame. Grace took a slow breath. For years, she thought her voice didn't matter. But tonight had proved otherwise. She looked around the room, at the guests who now saw her for who she really was, at Elena, whose courage helped uncover the truth, and at Mr. Daniels, who still believed in her. With quiet grace, she turned back to Mr. Whitmore. "I forgive you," she said softly, "but I'm not staying." She walked out of that mansion not as a maid, but as a musician, a woman reclaiming her story. Months later, Grace stood on a grand stage, playing to a full concert hall. Her name was printed in gold on the program, her talent finally given the space it deserved. And in the crowd sat Elena, Thomas, and even Mr. Whitmore, silent, older, changed. Grace's journey reminded everyone watching that talent knows no status, no uniform, no limits. Sometimes, all it takes is one moment of courage to break free, and one song to change everything.